Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion this evening. This is the Etc. group, and we'll be having a discussion on a topic that's stimulating a lot of debate and which has many different layers to it. And that is looking at the relationship between the COVID pandemic and technology. Those backing big and risky technologies are winning all the way in this COVID crisis, from the rise of Zoom and Netflix to enhanced data surveillance of populations. Big tech is not only shaping how the crisis is tackled and lived, but they're also positioning themselves to shape behaviors and write the rules in a post-crisis new order. And at the same time, the crisis has revealed the fragilities of our technologically dependent systems, exposed the influence of tech billionaires, and rekindled debates over safety, risk, and perverse techno-scientific policy advice. So today I'll be speaking with members of the Etc. group who are here, and they are Veronica Villa in Mexico, Neth Daño in the Philippines, and Jim Thomas here in Canada. So I'll just very quickly ask you to give a brief introduction and perhaps mention a little bit about the COVID pandemic where you are, and then I will start with the questions. So Veronica, maybe you can start off with a brief introduction.
Thank you, Zahra. Yes, my name is Veronica, as Zahra said. I work with the TC Group and I am based in Mexico City. So we do a lot of work with peasant communities and focused on food issues, seeds, and peasant indigenous strategies for life. And here in Mexico, we are now is mid-May and we are in the peak of the contagious week, so to say, the contagious period of the pandemic. So the lockdown is really strict. And well, people is suffering a lot because half the population in Mexico, in the whole country, lives day by day out of informal economy. So you don't go out, don't get to buy, ice cream or newspapers or flowers or just the daily meals outside, no? And a lot of people work that way. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you, Veronica. Neth, this is Neth Daño in the Philippines. Can you perhaps do a brief introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Zahra. I'm Neth Daño. I'm based in southern Philippines, in Davao City, where we have been under some form of lockdown. We call it the enhanced community quarantine since the end of March. So this is our 8th week of being under ECQ, enhanced community quarantine, which limits our mobility. Of course, like we've been issued food and medicine pass. You're only allowed to go out of your house to buy food, medicine, and for some emergencies and very urgent bank transactions, you have to carry this pass with your valid ID. You have to go through checkpoints, mostly manned by police in fatigue and some army personnel as well. And yesterday I saw an armored personnel carrier in one of the checkpoints that I've gone through. Like you're also limited to movement within your district under the clustering system. And of course, you cannot go out every day. There's an assigned date for every person bearing a food and medicine pass, depending on your last digit. That, of course, greatly limit not just mobility, but also the means of people to earn in a city that is not so huge, about 2 million people, but just the same, a lot of the people who are working depend on the informal economy as described by Veronica in Mexico. And you have all these people who depend on running public transport, like the local public transport, which have been stopped from operating. And people, of course, have to rely more and more heavily on the local food system.
Great, thank you so much, Neth. And finally, Jim, please can you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Jim Thomas. I work with the Etc. group and probably spend more of my time tracking the technological issues around biotech and big data and corporate concentration. I'm actually based up in the mountains north of Montreal in Quebec. And Quebec under COVID is it's an interesting situation too. Initially, the province took a very precautionary line. and so very strong measures were taken to ensure people stayed home and so forth. And however, in the last sort of, I'd say the last 3 weeks, 2-3 weeks, there has been a noticeable shift with the government now trying to push to open up the province, particularly in these rural areas, such as where I am. This despite the fact that Quebec has soaring cases of COVID and large numbers of deaths. It's now, I think, something like the 7th or 8th worst situation in the world. So the population here, people here are really very confused by that, having had very clear precautionary messages and people really agreeing with that. They're now having this very strong back to work, reopen the economy. Schools are being forced against their will to open and take children, and messages are changing. So it's an interesting and slightly worrying moment. I mean, the silver lining is very similar to what Neth sees in Davao. We're seeing amazingly strong strengthening of local food links, like never before. Gardens are going in, people are supporting community-supported agriculture, particularly in rural communities. There's a real strengthening of local resilience. So that's the good news.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your introductions and for giving us an update on where you are. I'm Zahra Moloo, also with Etc. Group, and I'm based in Montreal and mainly working on technology assessment and related issues in Africa. So I'll start off with a question on the data and the data giants. So, you know, we see that the COVID crisis has led to a massive strengthening of data giants and biotech companies. And we see that most of the focus has been on surveillance and conversations around contact tracing relating to the virus. But we know that the issue is a lot bigger than that. So I'm wondering if, I'll start off with you, Jim. Can you talk about how data giants and tech companies, including biotech companies, are benefiting from this crisis? And are there areas that are not being spoken about in the media that we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the first thing to point out is that we were already undergoing a major structural change in our global economy around data and technology. The World Economic Forum calls this the fourth industrial revolution, the idea that the coming together of big data, artificial intelligence, new technologies, whether it's biotechnologies or blockchains and so forth, is really overturning one after another economic area. I think one of the really interesting things about this moment is what it allows in terms of surveillance by tech companies. And we've been hearing about this notion of surveillance capitalism and also data colonialism. That what's going on at the moment is that these companies, whether it's Facebook, Google, Amazon, are gathering a treasure trove of data about us and what we buy, what we eat, where we travel, and so forth. Now, COVID has been an absolute gift to them. What better way to surveil a population than to put them all in their homes and have them all connecting by digital platforms, including buying food by digital platforms, talking through work and everything by digital platforms. So there's, you know, the level of surveillance that's possible in this sort of lockdown mode right now is really unprecedented. And it goes to everything, including electricity use and so forth. Measuring poop in the sewers. You know, this is the data that's being produced at the moment is incredible. And then, you know, these companies are really interested in getting into areas where they can gather large amounts of data about individuals and then apply them to improving business models. And food is one of the best places to get data. What somebody eats, how often they eat, and this is a massive industry, and it's got all sorts of inefficiencies that can be improved. And people eat all the time. It's not like buying books on Amazon. You eat all day long, if you're lucky, and you seek food. And what food you eat tells a lot about who you are. And so the sort of rich data you can get about individuals, which is why Amazon bought Whole Foods, and then it's why, you know, these companies are buying delivery companies and so forth, food delivery companies. can be married then with all the production data on the field, the genomic data for producing the crops and so forth. You know, you begin to have this rich amount of data all the way through the food system, which is far more interesting than just the social media watching videos kind of data. And at the other end, you know, half of it's about surveillance, but the other is about manipulation. Increasingly, we're realizing that what's interesting about data surveillance is it gives, with machine learning and artificial intelligence, it gives the potential to start manipulating consumer behavior, often in ways they don't understand. We have a whole new area of nudging, hyper nudging. Food companies are interested in something called personalized nutrition, where as they better understand you and people like you, through the massive amount of data they're collecting, they're going to start nudging you towards changing your diet in certain ways and buying certain things. And then they can nudge the food system to fit that. So this is why data companies, data giants are so interested in getting into food. And that's, you know, when we talk about, for example, Facebook putting a 10% stake in the largest telecoms producer in India, this is also about food. I mean, Neth's from Asia, she can probably talk better to this than I can.
Well, in fact, that's a great way to link to the next question I had, which is, you know, there has been a lot of coverage of how the industrial food system is very much, you know, could very much be creating these pandemics, and looking at, you know, how food production is now encroaching on wild habitats, providing opportunities for pathogens to jump to livestock and people, but also breeding diseases, contributing to antibiotic resistance and climate change. But we don't hear so much about the overlap between data and agriculture. And so perhaps, Neth, I'd like to ask you if you have any insights on what is important to pay attention to when we look at the food system and the kind of interventions that Jim has described in terms of digitalization and data in the food system.
It's very interesting how this whole discussion on the underlying reason behind the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, is being projected in mainstream media. Of course, there are some analysis about the role of industrial agriculture creeping into some mainstream publication, but it's not really the kind of prominent projection or really mainstream analysis that we would really want to see, that it deserves, that discussion deserves. Like, it deserves much more. It deserves a way worse way of projecting that industrial agriculture is a big culprit behind this. There's of course a lot of the social media discussions that even creep into some political statements of world leaders has been too oversimplified about blaming China, blaming this and that, but really not comprehensive, not even a realistic or even something that touches the core in terms of identifying industrial agriculture's role behind this pandemic and the previous pandemics. Like we know very well how SARS clearly came from commercial poultry and really disrupted world economy some many years ago in the early part of the new century, but much less link between industrial agriculture, commercial agriculture has been established in terms of this one, like the COVID-19 pandemic. And like much of the analysis that came out is of course about linking the situation in industrial agriculture and how this has bred viruses and the contagions that the world have to deal with now. But very little as well has been projected in terms of the role of big agricultural companies behind the agriculture that dominates the world now. There's nothing that says that of the animal genetics companies globally, like about virtually all of it, all of the market in animal genetics, both poultry and piggery, are actually under the control of just three companies that are located in in the north, no, in the US, and also Tyson Foods and Hendrix Pharmaceutical, EW Group, that control virtually all of the market in animal genetics. And of course, an emerging company coming from this region in particular is Charoen Pokapan, based in Thailand, or CP, which has expanded globally, that virtually controls all of the poultry genetics around this region. And what does poultry or livestock genetics mean? Like, I think we have to see it broadly. Like, this is like domination of 4 companies in the seed industry in terms of plants. Like, the seeds that are being used to breed animals that are in poultry and also in piggery that are being used globally are just produced by 3 companies. And these 3 companies rely on largely highly uniform genetics that actually that could spell doom to the industry itself, because we all know from the seed lessons and also from basic genetics that the more uniform your population is, the more susceptible it is to pests, diseases, and all the problems that are rooted to biological characteristics. And what we're seeing now, what we've seen in SARS, what we've seen in avian flu, is all about the problems that are highlighted in industrial agriculture. And now we're seeing as well that the jumping of the problem from animals to humans and all these zoonotic problems. And this is barely touched in mainstream media. And unless we really expose this, unless we really make this discussion mainstream, we will go back to a normal that has been responsible for the problem that we are facing now in that so-called new normal that everybody is talking about. This has to be dealt with front and center, of course. And in the midst of all this discussion about reviving the food chain, the industrial food chain, that's what it is of course the issue about making the real economy, the real web that made many of the people survive and grapple and cope with the challenges of the pandemic during the pandemic itself, and make that invisible. You know, like the one that I'm talking about, the direct consumer producer link that I'm talking about, is barely being touched and projected as well in the discussion of the new normal. And this is largely because we have barely scratched the surface in terms of what was the underlying causes of the problem. And unless we scratch that, we actually won't be able to see that there needs to be alternatives, and those alternatives made people survive during the pandemic, and this will continue to be invisible. The web that Jim was talking about in terms of the agricultural system that enabled people to survive through crises like this will remain invisible, when in reality that's what kept life during this crisis. So we have to really make sure that we seize the narrative, not just among those who believe in the alternative, but in the mainstream media. So the link between industrial agriculture and big tech, and as mentioned by Jim, there's really a growing interest among tech companies about seizing the moment in the establishment of the new normal. And the new normal in many of the narratives of politicians, particularly in this part of the world, is for people to shift to not just working from home, but as you work from home, you will not go out to buy your food, but you have to rely on delivery systems. You have to rely on the digital platforms that are provided by the big chain, so you can order your food and it will be delivered in your doorsteps. And of course, we know that the big retailers and the wholesalers would rely on the chain that is largely anchored on the industrial food system. And that will again bring us to that same cycle that brought the SARS, the avian flu, and COVID-19. But more in this situation where you have digitalization as the part of the new normal that is being painted by politicians globally. Like you have bigger role, much bigger role attributed to tech companies because they're the ones that provide the platform that enabled these delivery services, that enabled supermarkets and the big chains, supply chains to reach out to the consumers. But again, it makes invisible the reality of those people who are not part of that digitalization world. The small scale farms around here that have been supplying us with healthy food, with organic food, will not be able to tap that high-tech digital mode that will enable direct link to the consumers, but will continue to rely on words of mouth, on basic phone, calling your farm to be able to get your fresh batch of vegetables for this week. So you have to see that there are two narratives that are being that actually characterize our world now. The narrative that um, that media and also some of the world leaders want us to believe that everyone will go digital because of the situation that the pandemic has brought, and the invisible narrative that actually provides the survival for those who don't have access to that digital platform, who don't want to be part of the digital platform and want to support directly farms and local producers. And I think this is the kind of world that will continue to characterize as we face the so-called new normal. And that invisible world that is not projected in mainstream media is one that we should really be projecting, folding in our analysis, and also projecting in terms of how people should be able to live a more sustainable and fairer world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. On that note, on narratives that we don't see or narratives that are invisible, Veronica, I'd like to ask you, this pandemic has, put a lot of challenges into focus, but also prompted many people to ask, what is the other new normal that we could have? What are the opportunities to remake the world we live in ways that are more sustainable? So how are communities, indigenous communities and others facing this crisis, Veronica? How are they responding? Are there, community-centered alternatives, solidarity economies that we could look to, that we could learn from?
Yes, is what Jim and Ned have been describing is crucial to understand if we have something to learn from these other ways of facing the pandemic. No, all the digitalization processes and the invasion of internet in every moment of our lives has a very concrete cost. No, I have heard that maybe the oil prices are up and down and a lot down because mobility based on fossil fuels is so diminished now, but the prices of certain minerals are on the peak because the extraction is not stopping. No, the use of water for all the manufacturing of new gadgets and the deployment of wires across communities, and of course the satellites and the enormous facilities that are installed in forests, in lands where there are no urban developments. So you have the invasion of the communities has not stopped. No, the pandemic has also promoted more extractivism and more exploitation of resources that still now are usually in the lands of indigenous and peasant communities. No, so what I have seen is mostly from Mexico, but also from Latin America, and we have heard someone saying recently, we are seeing how the traditional is being adapted to the extraordinary. But that is what Native people have always done, no? Because they have lived through, in the limits since the beginnings of globalization, maybe. Not being really subject to political policy, to public policies, no, like services or electrification or roads or as Ned was describing, even cities in Philippines, cities in Latin America, so many cities in Africa, in Asia, have poor internet connections, poor water services, no? So the communities have been living in the limit all the time. When they are taking into account, when they have been considered in the midst of this pandemic, has been just to order them to lock themselves, to not go out. Otherwise, they are guilty of more, more spreading of the viruses, etc. They have no say in the approaches that have been implemented, no? But they are implementing their own mitigation strategies, and yes, they are self-isolating. They are producing, for instance, information and booklets in their languages, associating the symptoms to the remedies that they know, that they have always known. So this speaks of the need of really taking into account these other systems of knowledge and these other technologies. The public health strategies in general could be better if the rural dwellers participate in the solutions, because most of them still utilize a very old tool that is the assembly, the common agreement, gathering and discussing and reaching consensus. And maybe sometimes they have to take very drastic decisions, but they know, no? And when this special measure is applied, is effective because it comes from the voices of the people, it comes from the assembly, it comes from the leaders or the traditional authorities give voice to these collective decision-making processes. So I think we in the cities, in our works, we have to teach our children to implement these ways of solving problems in a collective way, no? Of course, neoliberal aid programs and government programs aim to destroy that kind of autonomy, no? And in this way, have more clients for the services. It's the same as flooding countries in Africa with cellular phones. No? It's the same way of the digitalization of life. Of course, to the companies and the owners of the money, the big money, they are not interested in communities that are in the places where the resources are. They don't want them to have any decision power. The communities are living very ugly things, like most of the rural workers in working in the fields of the industrial agriculture in United States, in Mexico, and even in Canada, for what I know in this continent, they are mostly indigenous, from indigenous origin. They have a peasant life when they go back to their places. They are trapped. You know, I have heard that India had this drama also with the pandemic, no? They are trapped, they try to come back, they find that their communities are totally closed. So they, in the worst cases, they are wandering in the cities totally away from the services, with the language barrier, impossible to walk towards where the ventilators are. And in the best cases, they are organizing like quarantine houses collectively, so they can be there and then enter their communities. In last April, more than 100 Mayan organizations from Mexico and Guatemala launched a statement where they demand that the social determinations, using this language, of the pandemic be addressed by the governments. No? Like they are daring to speak right to the core of the problem. No? Like, what are really the causes? And among many other demands, they are asking that the local and traditional health systems be acknowledged as valuable as the national public health systems. No? That the stopping the violence against midwives and doulas, for example, and that their medicinal plants and the way they use them don't be subject to intellectual property rights, and that their practices are not criminalized because, you know, it's not official medicine or Western sciences, no? There is practically no research in other health systems in prevention or mitigation strategies that don't come from the Western science. The food crisis among communities is also an issue. Many communities are cornered to be poor, to depend on money, but many others have like different degrees of independence with respect to the markets. So they are reviewing how much grain they have on storage and what are the next things that are going to be harvested, no, fruits, herbs, or the animals that each family has in their own homes, no, in their yards. And they are making their calculus, no? But they, at some degrees, at different degrees, indigenous and peasant communities won't suffer as much as the people, the poor people in the cities that only depend on having an employment to get a salary, then to go and buy food. We saw at the beginning of this, we saw a video in social networks from Ecuador, from indigenous peoples in Ecuador, arriving to the city and just downloading potatoes and milk and carrots and lots of things just to give away, because this was the moment of the harvest and they had so plentiful, you know, harvest that they decided to go to the city in this moment of pandemic and just give it away. So finally, we can draw a parallel between how much ignorance there is about peasant food systems, the peasant food networks that contribute with more than 70% to the food that sustains the people in the planet. No? There is so much ignorance about that fact. And the ignorance about the peasant and indigenous therapeutics and communitarian health strategies, to say something, no, something else. After all, for centuries, it has been said that the peasant world will disappear, you know, in theory, in analysis, no, like the peasants are like species in extinction. But through the centuries and the millennium, they have survived. So they must know something about nurturing life.
Right, thanks so much, Veronica. You've addressed so many aspects of this crisis, the precarity of people in the urban areas. You know, it's important to think about traditional knowledge, especially as we continue talking about, you know, the possibility of a vaccine, but then there are all these other traditional, you know, medicine that is not being talked about. And so just in closing, since, you know, we've covered a lot and there's so much one can still say about all these different aspects, just in closing, you know, given that the tech companies and data giants are, you know, really seeing this as an opportunity, given the erasure of narratives around the industrial food system, and given, you know, what you've mentioned, Veronica, about peasant communities and indigenous communities, what should we be doing going forward as social movements, civil society organizations, that's not already being done? You know, people are monitoring, people are doing a lot of analysis, but are there specific areas that we should be intervening in or focusing on or paying a lot of attention to? Just very briefly, Jim.
So I mean, one thing that I think a lot of civil society is focusing on, has to be pitching in on, is how the recovery is framed. That this, you know, after this sort of zero gravity moment where corporations are rearranging the settings, when the gravity's turned back on again, the recovery is when the new rules are being set up. And we have to be really careful that we're not signing on to proposals that sound good, green recovery, the Green New Deal, the you know, world leaders helping out with hunger, without going into the details. And when those details are about an agricultural transformation based on digitization and investment in value chains, some of those things should be red flags. So these aren't the people who kept people alive during the lockdown. These are not the people who were on the front lines during. I mean, I think the most tragic thing would be that not only is the narratives of the Brazilian food web erased by the language of digitalization being the thing that got us through, but that actually the people who really were on the front lines, the workers in grocery stores and delivering food who kept the bits of the chain to keep the urban areas going, also at the end of the day get replaced by robots and blockchains. So we have to recognize that the food chain, shonky though it is kept alive manages to feed a few people, and it does it on the back of workers who are very badly treated and who really stepped up in this moment, and that where they're holding hands is with the food web. And yeah, so the recovery, let's not let it become this greenwashing.
Okay, thank you. Neth, any closing words
Yeah,
for the going forward, very briefly?
Yeah, I will continue to use the zero gravity analogy of gym. I think this is really the moment to pounce for us to make the formerly invisible visible. So when gravity is back again, we have to make sure that everyone and the furnitures and everything that was really floating up there will be arranged in a way that we want to. And also the first order of the moment is really making the invisible visible. And Veronica mentioned about the peasant food web feeding at least 70% of the world's people. And in fact, FAO placed that as at least 80%. So we have to make sure that it does not remain to be the room that is invisible to everybody. It's not just the elephant, it's the room that feeds the people, but we don't want to recognize that. As I mentioned, it has become invisible, and the way things are being planned now around reconstruction, recovery, there is this danger that it will continue and even more so become much more invisible because digitalization has become the mode of the game in terms of supplying food from food producers to consumers. Even that whole framing about recovery, reconstruction, we have to be very careful about that because what we want is actually reinventing, regeneration, something that will start us to see, that will make us see the reality rather than being blinded by all these promises and manna and utopia that has digitalization at its core. And that has to start from the local, as I mentioned, like really ensuring that what was revived during the pandemic will be the normal and will be visible to everyone. At the national level, like in the Philippines, it's quite amazing how the Philippine government has actually mobilized its Department of Agriculture to provide mobile market, like directly getting produce, the excess produce that cannot be sold by farmers, as Veronica was describing, directly providing transport and bringing that to urban areas. And that really kept the economy alive. And yet, it's not part of the reconstruction, recovery that's being painted. There's a very clear problem in rationality and logic in there, because one that has worked during the crisis is just being relegated to a crisis moment, that it can't be the normal, even if it meant providing livelihood and income for food producers, directly cutting off the middleman, bringing directly to consumers. Like, it's clear transport, access to market are the main problem. It's not even production by the people who feed us, it's really reaching the consumers directly. So I think that kind of the effort, whether that's called recovery, reconstruction, rehabilitation, regeneration, or reimagining, should really include that as the hub. And lastly, at the global level, like before we went into the pandemic crisis mode, there was this huge discussion on having a World Food Summit that is initiated by the World Economic Forum, by industry and business, ironically, which is very much part of the problem. We have to seize that. We have to really, really seize that and take that away from the people who are robbing us of that, of drawing and of painting that narrative. Like in the recovery mode that we are entering right now, with the easing out of the lockdowns, we have to make sure that we seize that discussion and the narrative, shaping of the narrative of food governance at the global level, that it's not the Tysons, it's not the Hendricks and the EW groups that will play a key role in shaping the governance of food in this world that we are facing now, but it should be those that feed 70-80% of the world's people, not just through the crisis, but even before we enter the crisis. So it's all about seizing narrative and also shaping the narrative that will define the world that we will live in. And there are already preparations for that. The challenge is for us, civil society, social movements, and the people who feed the world to seize that moment.
Okay, thank you. And like you said, making the invisible visible, of which there are so many examples. Veronica, last words.
Yes, yes. Lots to say, and we've been touching a lot here. I would just say we need to be aware that peasant and indigenous and rural communities and more urban agricultures feed the world now. But this is endangered, no? This is under threat, and we can't be idle against with respect to that. I mean, when some people learns about this, no, they start asking, so land reform is not needed anymore, no? But no, I mean, they still feed the world. The peasant web still feeds the world. But if we don't seize the moment, as Neth said, it's going to be really a disaster, no, for future generations. Just that.
Okay, thank you so much to all of you. And we will be, as Etc. Group, we do have publications on the food system, the industrial food chain, and the peasant food web, where there's more of this information on, which Jim has, on Who Will Feed Us, which was published in 2017, and that's on Etc. Group's website. We'll also be doing a bit more reflection on the COVID moment and relationships to technology. So to follow our work, please go to www.etcetera.group.org. So thank you so much for participating, and we will hopefully see you in the future.
Thank you, Zahra.
Thank you, Zahra. Bye.
Bye.